loud. Hi, my name is Carolyn Gage, and today I'm going to be interviewing Jennifer Lunden, who goes by Lunden, and her amazing book called American Breakdown, Our Ailing Nation, My Body's Revolt, and the 19th Century Woman Who Brought Me Back to Life. And I'm just going to put that on the screen right now. There it is. All right. Lunden is an author who writes at the intersection of health and environment. She's also a former therapist named Maine Social Worker of the Year in 2012. She was the 2019 recipient of the Maine Arts Fellowship for Literary Arts. And I'm talking to her today, as I said, because she has written the most amazing book. And I just really want to get the word out about that. Short title, American Breakdown. And Lunden and I have some things in common. We both live in Maine, we're both writers, and we both live with ME/CFS, which is also known as chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis. And we both have lived with it, I believe, for almost 25 years. I got sick in 1987. And I believe you got sick in 89. Is that
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
Yay. Good luck. Oh, so why don't you start out by telling us something about that, when and how you realized you were sick, and if it's even possible for you to condense your journey of trying to find a practitioner who could diagnose and treat you appropriately. Really quickly, I'll just say I got sick in 87 working at a library in Portland, Oregon, and the flu went through the library, as flu does. Everybody got sick. I got sick like nobody's business. I'd had flu as many times as the average American. This was unlike anything I'd ever had, and it was accompanied by extreme back pain in the area of the kidneys, so bad I couldn't sleep. It was unlike any flu I'd ever had. And took me about 3 weeks to recover. And then I began to realize I never recovered again. The fatigue set in. And then as the months went by, the cascade of other terrifying side effects. And I am still disabled today. So that was my story. It was very clear. It was very clear. There was flu. There was a flu episode.
Yeah. And it sounds so much like what people are experiencing with long COVID too.
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah. But many people with this disease, that it wasn't so clear, like totally healthy, really, really sick, and then, pretty sick the whole rest of my life with episodes of relapse. All right, so tell us about how you got sick and how you were sick and the journey to diagnosis and appropriate treatment.
So I moved to Maine in January or February of 1989. And I moved here to start my adult life. I was so excited. I've dreamed of that day since I was like 11. And it was really stressful. My mom lived in Camden, so I'd grown up with my dad. And she was the only person I knew in Maine. And I knew nobody in Portland where I was moving. So it was just really stressful to just sort of move into a new life where I had no connections, and also very exciting. But for whatever reason, I came down with a case of mono within, I think, about 3 months. So I was still in the process of like I'd started a new job, and but I was just feeling tired, and it wasn't going away. And so I got the diagnosis of mono and was told to rest. And mono can take a long time to recover from. And I bet a lot depends on how much people are able to rest and how much stress they're under. But in my case, I never recovered. So I my first doctor when I moved here. So that was another thing, is I'd moved from Canada, where I'd been obviously covered by universal insurance, and I moved here at the age of 21. And my dad had suggested maybe I get traveler's health insurance just in case. And I was like, I can't really afford it. And I'm just 21 and I'm healthy. So I had no health insurance and had to pay a doctor out of pocket, even though I was, couldn't work very much and was making probably close to minimum wage. And the doctor that I got turned out to be, I always felt like she wasn't, I could feel resentment. I could feel something that was not compassion. That's all I could feel, was that she wasn't being compassionate. She didn't have compassion for the level of suffering that I was in, where I was so exhausted that I could barely get out of bed, and I was working when I shouldn't have been. And I was having all these other symptoms of my body. It just felt like my body was falling apart. And then I was simultaneously depressed because all that stuff was happening. And I went to see her way longer than I ever would now, maybe 3 or 4 times over a period of some that many months, maybe, I don't know. And testing came up normal. The mono had lifted, like the virus there's no longer evidence of the virus. And she just and at the time I wasn't able to work at all. I had taken a leave, and then it was clear I just couldn't go back, and I needed to be on welfare. And she had signed you had to get a doctor's note at that time to be excluded from having to do work fare. So if you're getting welfare, you had to work, you had to clean the sides of the roads or do other kinds of work, which I couldn't do. So she did that for me the first time. But then the second time, when I called and said I was going to need that again, she refused. And that was the time where she finally revealed what I had felt all along, that she felt like it was depression. She thought the best thing for me would be to go back to work. And that was the last time I consulted with that doctor. And
I just want to cut in and say that I was very low income at that time. I did have health insurance, but the deductible was really, it was like I had no insurance. And I went to the doctor, and they do a blood test, probably minimal, and a urinalysis.
Yeah.
And that's it. And
you're normal. You have nothing wrong with you.
And this is actually still, sadly, ask people with Lyme. This is pretty much still the protocol. You got to fight. First off, they have now justify it to insurance. Why are you doing all these elaborate exotic blood tests? But back then I wasn't even offered that option.
Yeah.
And this stuff, it doesn't show up in those.
Right. And so when it doesn't show up in those, the doctors, same with long COVID, the doctors say, well, there's nothing wrong with you, rather than saying, perhaps we don't have the tests that will tell us what's wrong with you, or perhaps there's something that I don't know. I mean, there are more tests now for getting to the bottom of the possibility of ME/CFS, but only the specialists know about those, I think. And
well, in fairness, I think we have to remind our viewers, it was, for me, 87, for you, 89. Internet didn't really be a thing till 95, 96.
Yeah.
Possibly these people, especially because I think you pushed back harder than I did. I'm very, very, I'm very sensitive to rejection.
Yeah.
As soon as someone doesn't believe me, I think it comes from child sexual abuse. Anytime I'm not believed, I'm out of there. I'm not going to push back. I'm not going to ask you to believe me. I'm not going to try and argue my case. I'm gone. But I read your narrative and other people's, and I think some of these doctors might have jumped on the internet, just taken a look. But back then it wasn't an option. That's all they knew. And
that was the messaging that the CDC was sending out.
Absolutely.
It was just hysterical women.
Yeah.
And so that was the message. And it was only a few real trailblazers who were doing the research and treating patients and treating them with respect. and
And it's a
sometimes finding things that helped.
it's a big deal that it was predominantly women getting sick.
Yes,
And
it
I
is.
think long COVID is possibly identical to ME/CFS. It's definitely in the family,
Yep.
close relative, if not the relative. But now we're seeing more men getting sick. But back in the day, it was so overwhelmingly women. And if you know anything about the history of medicine, you know, it's a crazy, lazy disease.
Right. I'd never heard it put that way, but yes, that's how it's been seen.
Oh, look, I have a patient who's crazy and she's lazy.
Yep.
Women. Women. Yeah. You don't have to make
right.
you don't have to make that case too hard for people to go along with it. It's just like
No. And a
when you
lot of that is
consider
because of the influence of Freud.
I mean, when I consider that Serena Williams almost died because she wasn't believed when she was in the hospital,
Yep.
having difficulties, intimately aware of her health history. I mean, she's an athlete, you know, and she wasn't believed. There's no hope. She was a woman of color.
Yes.
You know, nobody listened to her, and she came so close to dying. I'm like, oh my God, what prayer does anybody have?
Yes.
You know, if Serena Williams gets that treatment. But it is true. And it was very, very easy to get away with the crazy, lazy diagnosis because we were women. And
Yeah.
also, we're a body of people who are too sick to really push back. That's been a huge issue.
Yep.
We can't take to the streets. We can barely put together a signature campaign. It's, you know, it's beyond exhaustion. It's complete debilitation.
Yeah.
Where, yeah, oh my God, I had a friend who moved her mattress into the bathroom because going to another room to go to the bathroom wasn't an option. She would soil the bed, or she had to put the mattress literally inches from the toilet. And she lived like that for 6 months. People don't understand when you say, I'm exhausted. And I knew people in the Bay Area that couldn't turn over in bed. I mean, zero energy, like zero.
Yes.
And yeah, so yes, we're a pretty easy block of people to steamroller. We're not going to make a fuss. We can't even get to the bathroom. So I'm going to shut up. I am autistic. I do just take off. So
Well, those are all good points.
I have so much to say about that. Let's do an 8-hour, you know, please. You were telling us, yes. Okay. So
my medical story. And so, so the next piece is, and I'll say, like, I stuck with her longer, I did say this, than I would now. Because I was 21, I just moved here. I'd never had a bad doctor experience. I didn't know any better. If I'd known better, I would have left after the second appointment because she was being cold to me. But I didn't know other doctors to go to. Anyway, after that happened, I was done. And ever since that, I am extremely cautious about the doctors I see. I usually try to get recommendations from other people I trust. Sometimes I found an amazing psychiatrist not too long ago just by searching for somebody who took my insurance on the internet, and he's great. So, but like, I'm discerning, and if somebody is, I had a dermatologist recently who was just paternalistic with me. I didn't like it at all, and I gave him one more chance, and then I was like, no, I'm finding somebody else, and I found somebody wonderful. So, like, to me, that's like something I want to encourage people who have options. It's harder when you live in the country versus the city, to leave doctors who are dismissive or disrespectful to you and find somebody who is better. And I was really fortunate because a friend of mine had a friend with what was then called chronic fatigue syndrome, and what we now call ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. And she hooked me up with a chronic fatigue syndrome support group, and they were able to recommend a doctor who could potentially give me the diagnosis. I believed I probably had chronic fatigue syndrome, but you know, the doctor I had didn't even believe that was a thing, right? Most doctors didn't believe it was even a thing. And so I did find my second doctor was somebody who recognized it as a real illness, and he diagnosed me with it. And diagnosis is so important. Not only it's validating, it's crazy making when you have an illness and nobody knows what it is, or worse, they tell you like it's nothing and you're really deeply sick.
And I just want to cut in and say that, given 1/3 of girls under the age of 18 are, sexually abused, and it's usually incestuous father figure or father authority figure, like a doctor. I feel like so many of us have prior histories of not being believed, of being gaslit. We're females.
Yep.
And in my generation, sexual harassment wasn't even a phrase.
No,
It was a
just
woman.
life.
It was a woman with no sense of humor in the workplace.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
There was no such thing as date rape. It was a bad date.
Yeah.
Move
Yep.
on. It was a bad date. And so we're used to that. We're like, that's our history till really recently, is like, we don't talk about it, or, we're not believed when we do. And so here we are with a medical condition, and it feels really familiar. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, here we are again. Plus now I'm exhausted. So I'm like, whatever,
Yeah.
it's really, it's cruel that it's a women's disease, because we have this whole socioeconomic, and then we make 70 cents to the dollar. It's just part of that suck it up, a woman's life. And yeah, but I found it very difficult to get a diagnosis because of all this internalized, nobody's going to believe me, head against the brick wall. Take it, and then taking care of yourself becomes problematic. Obviously, pursuing a diagnosis is taking care of yourself. However, in this situation, for me, it was just inviting abuse. It was
Right.
like, just read some books and go home, take herbs.
Let me tell. So one of the things I did before this interview is I had previously made a document for myself of all the quotes by Alice James, who's in the book. So, and you just said something that made me think of something that she said. So can I take a minute right now? This seems like a good
Yeah,
segue.
let's do that. By the way, I remind people, it was the subtitle of the book is Our Ailing Nation, My Body's Revolt, and the 19th Century Woman Who Brought Me Back to Life. And that is what Lunden is now going to take us into.
Yeah. So Alice James was a diarist in the 19th century, who's better known for being the sister of the writer Henry James and the psychologist William James. So she came from this like really intelligent and sort of charismatic, interesting family, but she was the only girl. And so she had access to the intelligence in her family, but she didn't have access to the same opportunities because she was a girl and then became a woman. And she fell ill with a mysterious illness that when I read the biography 6 years into my own illness, I read the biography of Alice James by Jean Strauss, and I felt like I'd met my illness sister, and I felt less alone. And also, like, she was so smart and so witty and edgy that she was like somebody I wanted to know. Like, if I had to be in an illness club, I wanted to be in one with Alice James, because I mean, in some ways she wasn't hip at that time, but like you read how edgy her words are and it's hip. So here's something she said to William. So William is her psychologist brother, and William at that point had I think he had a position at Harvard and was well known for some of his books that we still talk about. I spaced the name of one of them, but anyway, he's urged. By that time, I think she's in England. She moved to England at a certain point in her life and stayed there. And he was urging her, because she'd gotten even sicker, to find another doctor. And she wrote, "It may seem supine to you that I don't descend into the medical arena but I must confess my spirit quails before any more gladiatorial encounters. It requires the strength of a horse to survive the fatigue of waiting hour after hour for the great man, and then the fierce struggle to recover one's self-respect. I think the difficulty is in my inability to assume the receptive attitude, that cardinal virtue in women, the absence of which has always made me so uncharming to and uncharmed by the male sex.
Yep, yep. I had the great good fortune just a few years ago on this little island in Maine to go to the doctor who's around the block from me, and she acknowledged the medical abuse of people with ME/CFS.
Yep.
She acknowledged her own ignorance, the absence of it in her curriculum, the reality of the disease, everything. It was everything I had waited 35 years to hear. And in all those doctors, in all those years, she was the only one who was appropriate. And then I really trust her. And she is more than willing. There's an acknowledgement, which should be so obvious. It behooves me to study this disease and to network with thousands of people around the world with it. First thing I did with my computer. She was more than willing to acknowledge that we are the experts, that the medical community has utterly failed us, marshaling their resources to prove it doesn't exist, the crazy lazy thing. And the CDC led the charge on that.
Yep.
And she's like willing to acknowledge, you know far more about this than I do, as does your community, and to learn from us and to ask us, because we have had the time and the leisure, because we're too disabled to work, to do this research.
And the desperation.
We're a vast resource, but they're waiting for it to trickle down into their curricula, and it's never going to happen. And it's again, it's a women's disease. And I just feel so fortunate. That should have been a speech that every patient with a history like yours and mine receives right off the bat, just to be trustworthy. You're absolutely correct. And our whole, practice, our whole tradition has failed you people abysmally and has increased your suffering. And in many cases, used you as guinea pigs and increased your symptoms. It was just so lovely to hear it from somebody in a clinical setting.
It is so wonderful. And isn't it amazing, like how desperate we are to be cared for properly, that a doctor who says, I'm sorry, I don't actually know how to treat you, is a relief.
Yeah.
Because she did it with compassion.
Like, I have known you're ignorant all along. It's just really refreshing, because doctors who won't own that ignorance, and it's not her fault, it wasn't in her curricula.
Yep.
And I had a doctor before that 5 years ago who was citing the CDC, who still had up on their website that those of us with this illness need to exercise more. It's like somebody in a wheelchair, dude, all you need to do is stand up. And if that's too hard for you, do a bunch of graded exercises that will get you up on your feet. No reason for you to be in that wheelchair. Or you need, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's all in your mind. And the CDC had that up until 5 years ago. And there's a whole history behind that I won't go into, but I want to say it increased my suffering greatly that they did that. Today, this is what their website says, and they're ashamed. I've seen them in interviews. They're ashamed of their history with that, because they're dealing with long COVID people now. And the long COVID people are coming to the ME/CFS researchers. They know it's the same thing.
Yes.
Anyway, their website today says CFS is a serious, chronic, complex, systemic disease that often can profoundly affect the lives of patients, which was beautiful. It's like, if we seem to be emotionally disturbed, it may have something to do with the fact we can't get out of bed for decades, and we're told there's nothing wrong with us. That does begin to affect you psychologically.
That's right.
So today they haven't owned what they did and the damage of, the more exercise thing. But
Like reparations would be something, wouldn't it?
yeah, like they, I don't know if people know, but Congress finally did allocate quite a bit of money for this study, and the CDC just took it and spent it on something a little more trendy, because it's a political organization. They weren't going to get a lot of kudos for spending it on a women's crazy lazy disease. But yeah, but I love that it's serious, chronic, complex, and systemic, because I
Yes.
keep trying to say to the doctor, every single organ in my body, from my kidneys to my skin to my heart, everything is been completely impacted by this. And
Yes.
the eye roll, like
Ugh.
that's mental illness. That's what that is.
Oh my God.
So annoying.
I'm sorry that you're still getting that.
No, I just
it's so
stopped because I
fortunate.
found this doctor, but that woman was still doing that, and it was 2018. And I said,
Yeah.
that's incredibly irresponsible for you to say that to a patient, and I terminated my
You said that to her?
yeah, and I was waiting for her to, and I'm autistic, so not known for tact, all right, but I'd had it. That
Good.
study was bought and paid for by insurance people,
Yeah.
the one that was on that website, and she should know that.
Yep.
And people go home and kill themselves from
Yes.
being told the kind of stuff she was telling me. It's like the wheelchair thing. Just get
Yep.
up, stand up. What's wrong with it's just sometimes the straw that breaks your back.
Yeah.
And so I said, that is and I said it in my little monotone autism, that is incredibly irresponsible for you to say that to a patient with this disease. And she just kind of jumped back, and she just stared at me like we're going to have a staring contest. Like, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, I've been faking it for 35 years. I just was like, I'm so done with medical arrogance.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I I'm going to shut up. This is such an emotional issue for me. You're telling us about Alice James. How did you find somebody who finally got it right?
Well, the one I found was the one I found through, I think it was through a CFS support group, and I asked them and they told me like that. So that's what happens, is sometimes these support groups can be helpful in sort of like, they'll tell you who not to go to and who to go to. And so it's a way of getting that. So my second doctor gave me the diagnosis, and he was kind and respectful. He didn't have any treatments for me, but like just getting a diagnosis was amazingly empowering. Yeah. And one thing I wanted to say when you were talking is when you're talking about this way that doctors so often won't own that they don't know something.
Yeah.
And like one of the things I did in the book, and I tell you that like that first doctor that I had traumatized me. I have medical trauma
Yes.
to this day
Yes.
because of that doctor. And that's why I cannot tolerate any doctors who are dismissive or demeaning to me in any way, or cold. Like I can feel it when it happens, and I don't dismiss what I feel anymore. But one of the things I came up with was in part in the book. I talked about that, how like when doctors don't know something, they just say, well, either the patient's not sick, or else they say the patient is mentally ill and needs anti-anxiety meds or needs to go see a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And they rarely do what your wonderful new doctor did, which is own that they don't know. Yeah. And so they misdiagnose the patient, rather than I propose a new diagnosis that's for the doctor. And I had a friend who specializes in Greek language, probably ancient Greek, whatever. I had him come up with a diagnosis in Greek, and it's iatroporuresia, and it means something like doctors at a loss for knowing the cause. And I just feel like if doctors were trained and supported to be humble, which is not how they're trained. So one of the things that happened when I was writing the book, I went from hating doctors, except for my few, like there were, a few exceptions of wonderful doctors that I've had, but
Mhm.
hating doctors in general, like hating, to recognizing part of what I did in the book was I just kept asking more about, well, but why, but why? And each time it would take me deeper into more knowledge. And I wanted to go back to the source. And what's the source with doctors? Well, it's medical school. And what happens in medical school? They're overworked vastly, and much more so than in England, or probably in most if not all other countries, to the point of huge sleep deprivation. They're shamed, maligned, and abused when they get when they make when they get something wrong. And somehow doctors and their teachers think that that's a good way to teach people, but shame is not really a good way to learn, and being put into fight or flight shuts our brain down. It doesn't help us learn. And they do that even more for female doctors and doctors of color. So that kind of abusive atmosphere where they pay a ton of money and come out on the other side from somebody who most likely joined, went to school because they wanted to help people, come out on the other side feeling like they've sort of been through a war and they're owed something for that. And there's doctors, suicidal levels of doctors and med students are higher than ever. And they come in like with this closed mind, like, I have all the knowledge now, you don't have any. I mean, I still heard a doctor said to them the other day, you've been reading too much Medscape, or no,
Yes.
WebMD. That's what they said. You've
Well,
been
and
reading
here's
too
the
much
thing.
WebMD. Well, you know what? WebMD is actually a reliable source to get information.
Yes. And it's and for me, those early 96, there were, oh my gosh, the first people doing the chat list were the severely disabled, because we're so isolated. I got such a political education from those folks. It
Yeah,
was amazing. And there was an organization called Not Dead Yet.
yeah,
They absolutely gave me life. They were severely disabled people who were just militant,
yes,
and they taught me so much. It was incredible. But yeah, the doctor thing is huge. And also doctors and researchers, there's an overlap there. And a researcher going off and researching something that's not party line. And when I say party line, it's something that does not behoove the pharmaceutical industry or the insurance companies. And insurance companies, those of us with this disease, if we're severely impacted, we are as sick as AIDS patients in the last 2 weeks of their life. And then there's the good news and the bad news. The good news is you're not going to die, and the bad news is you're not going to die, and you're going to live like this forever. And that's expensive.
yeah,
The insurance companies from the jump were really clear. We need to call this a psychosomatic illness because it's going to cost us billions. And so any of the researchers and the doctors who were pursuing studies of this disease as if it was a thing were ostracized by their
yeah,
peers. They lost their funding, and they would actually be discredited, and their studies would be rejected for the peer-reviewed journals. And that's a whole scandal we're just finding out about now. But it took a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage for doctors to believe their patients. And we all
yeah,
know Freud believing women about the staggering percentage of child sexual abuse of female children. Was he just kind of uncovered it and then quietly backed away from it, like, this is going to cost me my career. And I think yeah, I think there were doctors who might have been interested if there was money, if there was research, if there was interest, if there was energy for studying this, but there wasn't. There was an absolute whiteout on it. Just
yeah. And somewhere along the line, I read about, and I'm sure this wasn't the only one, but I remember reading about a doctor who wanted to go into the field and
yeah.
study MECFS. And one of his advisors said, like, that's career suicide.
Yes. One of the major pioneers, if you go on the website, Solve MECFS, his son was one of the few males affected by it, and he was in his prime. I think he was in his 20s or 30s, traveling the world as a photographer, having a life. And he went to bed, and he was so ill that he had to be in a dark room, and he had to have noise canceling headsets, and eating was problematic. I mean, his inability to tolerate any stimulation. And this man just went to the wall for his son to find money. He already worked at Stanford, so he had access to all kinds of equipment that normally he wouldn't have. He had a lot of privilege, and he used all of it. And he wrote really poignantly about the suffering his son was going through. His son had lost his life without losing his life, and what he was up against. And you just think like, well, thank God, because he had resources and he had incentive. But most doctors, there's no incentive, and the resources were, even when they were funneled, like with CDC, they just sent it into another study.
Into other areas that had nothing to do with MECFS.
Yep.
That stuff's in the book, and I learned all of that from Hillary Johnson's Author's Web, which is like, when I got that book, it's like thick, and I was like, oh no, but I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. It was like so amazing. The history that she uncovered for us is really critical about the ways that MECFS was not taken seriously at the beginning, which is why we still don't have the research that we need for treatments that really work, and why still to this day doctors are dismissive. Not as many, but too many. Every single patient who's got MECFS will be able to tell you stories about being dismissed by doctors. And the same is true for people with women with autoimmune diseases. And the same is true with women's pain. So it's like a chronic issue. And one thing, I guess it gives me a little bit of hope, if this is weird, is like it seems like long COVID is being taken slightly more seriously, but it still is an issue where people aren't believed and aren't taken seriously. But one difference with long COVID is that it's so many doctors got it because they were on the front lines with no masks. And so now there are legitimate people who actually understand human biology who are saying, I'm really sick. And even those people, I remember reading an article, and there was a woman who like was either a doctor or a biologist. She knew what was going on in her body in a way that people like me can't know. Like I learned a lot in the process of writing the book, but I haven't had that kind of training. And she still went to a doctor who was dismissive, and she still sort of went through that sort of crazy making feeling where she ceded to the doctor at the beginning, and then somehow she got her power and she learned. But that's another thing, right? Is like, we women, including those of us who weren't sexually abused, like me, so we're still taught to be nice and to be compliant. And I'll tell you what, when I see a new doctor now, I still weigh out, how shall I present myself?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. A friend of mine, the woman who made the film Restless, a wonderful documentary about her journey with it. And she said that the conundrum, especially if you've been sick long enough, and let me just tell you, it's eating disorders, it's skin lesions. I had brain lesions, and I developed petit mal seizures, and it's just like utterly unrelated. Blood pressure issue, I was cold for 3 years. I ran a fever for 3 years. It's like every system of the body. Where was I going with that? I just lost it. What were you talking about?
We were talking about the biology and how even people who really know have a hard time. And women are trained to cede power to everybody, to
I can't
just be
remember.
nice.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things I did want to say was when long COVID started, I was waiting for the pushback because it was insurance companies who were
Right.
profoundly invested in making sure they didn't have to pay for this disease. And sure enough, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, the same old, you just need to get off the couch and exercise more. It's been proven, it's cognitive, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, those weasels, they're at it again. The next day, the New York Times ran a huge feature on the reality of long COVID, and that was the end of it. And I
Ah,
thought, it was like they tried. That was
yep.
obviously a put up job.
Yep.
They tried to float that, and the New York Times is like, no, too big, too real, too many important people getting sick. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I really like how you're sort of bringing in, like, a few times in this conversation, you've brought in the idea of capitalism. And so when I started writing the book, I was interested in Alice's illness, which was called neurasthenia, and mine, which is ME/CFS, and also multiple chemical sensitivity, which often goes hand in hand with ME/CFS. And I became interested in, I wanted to write something about our two illnesses and explore whether they could be one and the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, and what I didn't know is like where this deep dive into many different tendrils would lead me, which is to the idea that industrial capitalism is impacting all of our health in different ways, partly because of genetics. So the book talks about, there's a whole part about, I thought I was writing chapters, but they ended up being so long, I realized there were parts, and then I could separate the parts into chapters. So there's a whole part about the impact of stress. And in America, we have a belief that if you're not stressed out, you're not working hard enough. And even Alice commented on that in the 19th century. I'm just going to interrupt myself to say, when she moved to England, she said, let's see if I can find it.
While you look, I'll just say a little about what I know about neurasthenia. It was very common in the 19th century. And that's kind of a fancy term. If you were, down with the folks in the South, it was nerves. Oh, my mother
Right.
had nerves. She went to bed. She never left the bedroom. She had nerves. And that was the end of it. It was just understood, and it's kind of psychosomatic, and it was maybe a bad marriage or a way to get out of having serial pregnancies for a decade. I don't know. But it turns up in the literature over and over again, and then it begins to become neurasthenia. But I believe that this thing that affects women's biology is something that's been around for a very, very long time.
Yeah. And what she says here, after she moved to England, she said, it's rather strange that here, among the robust and sanguine, I'm going to say sanguine. Here, it's rather strange that here, among the robust and sanguine people, I feel not the least shame or degradation at being ill, as I used to at home among the anemic and the fagged. It comes, of course, in one way from the conditions being so easy, from the sense of leisure, work reduced to a minimum, and the god holiday worshipped so perpetually and effectually by all classes. And so she, even in the 19th century, there was a difference between how people move and work and take work in Europe versus how we do in the United States, where we're just work. And so that has an impact on our nervous systems and our whole immune systems. And there's all kinds of research in the book about that. And then I also wrote about the impact of chemicals, especially the kinds of chemicals that we bring into our homes that we think are safe, but because they think that the EPA and the FDA are protecting us from those things, right? And they are not. And people can read more about that in the book. I mean, it's just like jaw-dropping how not protected we are. And some of the chemicals that have been banned in Europe are still in our
very much
makeup and hair products, and
well, even food. I mean, the standards for
yeah.
our food are way below European standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. It's one of the things I loved about your book was that you didn't make these distinctions that serve the patriarchy and the corporate capitalists so well, of like, that's political. I run into this in theater. That's political theater. That belongs over here. And this is personal. That's female confessionalism. That was you kind of whining about your life, that belongs over here. And then there's literature and there's his, and you're just like, you're absolutely crossing fluidly. I feel like this is a disease of disconnection.
Yeah.
Western medicine is like, you locate the problem, like a wart, and you excise it, or you bombard it with something, or you dose it with, and this is systemic, and it is all systems. It is it's systemic. And I feel like that the cure is what you model in your book. Your book is a healthy book. It refuses to compartmentalize a subject that is systemic.
Right.
And I feel like you're not only talking about the cure, your book is the cure. This is how we must think. And you do it page by page, chapter by chapter. It's like, oh, she went over the fence into politics there. Whoop, she's jumped back into the 19th century. Well, now we're up with her private little conversation with her doctor. And it's like, it is all of a picture. It's all of a cloth. I love that. And again, I feel this is the difference between women's ways of thinking. And we know that from neuroimaging, the segregation synaptically of the male brain. And I feel like you're firing on all synapses across the cortex and integrating. And that is the approach, because as you know, with anybody who's gotten anywhere with this disease, and I do want to get to your experience with some of these, non-traditional modalities. But for me, people are like, I'm doing better than many of the women who were in the cohort with me that got sick in the 80s. And I was like, well, I kind of had the blessing of poverty. I was not used as an experimental guinea pig and given all kinds of drugs that made me sicker. I had three things I could afford to do: Al-Anon meetings, because they were $1 a meeting, yoga, and I did that in my home with a book. There wasn't any internet. And nutrition. I really studied up on nutrition, and I ate incredibly boring, but very, very well, and slowly kind of climbed out of it that way. But yeah, it's like the solution isn't going to be, here's a pill, or, we're going to locate the source of it and irradiate it. It's not going to be that. I got rid of toxic people. I learned boundaries. I learned accountability. I stretched every muscle in my body. I thought my energy may come back someday, and I don't want atrophied muscles.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize the enormous, wonderful integrative effects of yoga. I just was doing it so I wouldn't atrophy. But that was wonderful. And then nutrition is moving to the fore. And we see that with functional medicine. It's being acknowledged that, what a surprise, what you eat is actually what you're built of. Yes, but yeah, can you talk a little bit about your experience with experimental technique stuff?
Yeah. So first I'll say that, after that first traumatizing doctor basically told me there's nothing to do. And I knew that from reading too, like we had no treatments. So I couldn't go to a doctor for treatment. And what's left? If you're desperate and you want to get better, you'll do whatever. And so I tried every single thing that I could find, every alternative modality that I could find. And I mean, none of them cured me for a long time. But I kind of still feel like they were all loosening the lid.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I feel like they all helped. Some more than others. And then I don't remember the date now, but somewhere early on, there were a couple of new modalities that were being touted as brain retraining that's designed specifically for people with MECFS, MCS, fibromyalgia, and even PTSD and depression, anxiety, probably OCD, and other illnesses that are like systemic mind-body things. And I want to be really clear when I say mind body and I'm referring to MECFS, I do not mean it's all in your head. I do not mean it's psychological. I do not mean you're malingering. I do not mean you're crazy. Any of the messages that you've gotten from any doctors to that effect is not what I mean, and is not what these, both of these programs that I ended up using were designed by people who'd been affected by these illnesses. The first that I heard about and used is called the dynamic retraining, DNRS, dynamic neural retraining system.
Mhm.
And it was designed by a woman in Vancouver who was a therapist who became very ill with multiple chemical sensitivity after being in a toxic office. She didn't know it was toxic because we're not trained about that stuff. It took her a long time to figure out that, make the connection and get out of the office. And the other one that I wound up sort of blending in was the Gupta program. And that was a guy in London who developed MECFS when he was in college. And he designed both of these programs have a lot of overlap, and they're really similar in the idea that the brain has gotten the limbic system. That's a part of the brain that has to do with fight or flight. It's our protective part. It's the part that makes decisions to protect us in a way that's not even conscious to us, because it has to act fast. It's not the rational part. That limbic part starts to get into well, Annie Hopper's the one in Canada. She calls it cross wiring. Gupta, Ashok Gupta, he might just call it yeah, like a loop, like a limbic loop or something like that. And it just, so we end up sort of, the wiring on our brain goes into fight or flight the minute, well, another term to know is kindling. So, and there's research about this, and it's in the book about how, like, the more exposure that we have to something, it can kindle into something that we end up being like hyper reactive to things that we didn't used to be reactive to. And this can happen even to rats. So again, rats aren't crazy.
It sounds like to me that it's PTSD localized in the limbic system. And we know with PTSD, you get triggered by something, and suddenly there's to outsiders, an exaggerated response.
Yes.
Like multiple chemical sensitivities, you come in contact with those room fresheners or something.
Yes.
And or even I can be triggered by an essential oil, which in theory is non-toxic, but if the body is receiving it as a foreign whatever, all the trauma I've been through with this disease, I have an exaggerated response. There's a mast cell response. It's an all hands on deck, fire alarm, fire. But it is, I do think it's really similar. It's like a limbic response to just repeated assaults on the immune system.
I agree. And also, they also, or Annie Hopper at least also compares it to OCD. And so both PTSD and OCD are, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, are recognized. They're in the DSM, the sort of Bible for diagnostics for psychological illnesses, but they're recognized as mind-body illnesses. They're recognized as things that happen in the body as a result of something that's happening in the brain. And I feel like when we're talking about the brain is talking about the brain is different than talking about the mind. So the mind is this nebulous thing out there, and we can get maligned for having things in our mind, but this is in our brain, in our limbic systems, in our wiring, and our wiring impacts our entire body. So that those of us who have MECFS or MCS or PTSD, that's wired through our whole body, and we go into fight or flight when there's even like the smallest thing that reminds our limbic system, which is like a 3-year-old child, like young, that, oh no, I need to protect my human. I need to sort of do whatever I need to do to protect my person. And so brain retraining sort of takes that theory and has a sort of system of steps to go through that are are each designed to do something, like help to calm down the limbic system, rewire it by thinking about something, not just thinking about, but saying out loud, like a really happy memory with all the sensory details, or saying out loud a really happy future thing that you want to be able to do when you're recovered. And I can't describe all the steps for many reasons, including like copyright reasons, but those programs are both available online. And I did that, and because I'd already tried everything, I felt like this is the last piece of the puzzle. And it was easy for me to just set aside trying anything else and just focus on this. And it requires an hour a day of brain retraining, and also sort of interrupting any fearful thoughts in the moment. So like if I was walking behind bus exhaust, I might sort of run through some of the steps in my head to sort of interrupt the old wiring, and you're creating new grooves in your neural pathways. And so these kinds of treatments appear to be more effective than any other treatment that has been available for people with these illnesses.
Yeah.
And there is some research that I put in the book, and there's been a further study since that does seem to indicate that. And that said, they're still relatively new. They haven't been researched a ton. And what they do have is a lot of case studies. And I will say that I fully recovered for 3 years after using brain retraining in a way that I never had since I got sick. I was fully recovered. I was able to, I'm not going to say what it was, but I was able to do the future thing that I had envisioned. It's in the book. It still makes me smile to think of it. And then I got a cold, and I was under a lot of stress with my book deadline. And somehow the two of those things like overwhelmed all the brain retraining and the old wiring sort of, I don't know. This is all theory, right? I don't know what happened in my brain. All I know is I got very, very sick in 2019, October, and was completely, almost completely bedridden. Not quite so bad that I had to move my bed into the bathroom, but I would have say that my energy was below zero. It felt like anything that I did made it worse. People were driving me to appointments, so I didn't have to exert myself driving. And it was devastating. It was as bad as it was the first time. And I never, ever thought it would get that bad again. And so that doesn't mean that I think people shouldn't do brain retraining. I think it's a great option for people to try. And it doesn't mean it was a complete failure. I mean, I did eventually get out of that again, and I'm able to live a full life. I haven't fully recovered at this point, but I haven't given up.
Let me ask a question. Did it occur to you to start over?
Yeah. As soon as I realized, so it took me about 2 weeks where I was like, why am I so tired? Why haven't I gotten over this? Why do I have this weird congestion? And going to a doctor who was a stranger, because that's who was on call, and it was a man. And that was when I was like sitting in the chair, waiting for him and thinking, how am I going to present myself so I can not be dismissed? And he was pretty good, but I still felt dismissed. And part of that's trauma, right? He didn't have an answer for me. And right around, it took me about 2 weeks to be like, oh my God, this is a relapse. I have to start brain retraining immediately. And for me, I was like, great, this time I know what's happening and I know what I need to do, which is so different from the first time. It's so awful having a nebulous thing and you don't know what it's called and you don't know what to do. It feels so disempowering. And when you know what to do and you think you know what it is, it's empowering. And I really thought, like, okay, I know what to do. I'll probably kick this in a couple of months. It should be fine. But it took 7. It was devastating. And now I'm sort of, I got really busy when the book came out, and I'm like well enough that I can function, and I stopped with the brain retraining, and I have a plan to return to it. But it's also hard. I mean, it gets tedious to do it after
Yeah, I can
months.
see that. I just remembered the thing when I interrupted you, and I felt so bad about it because neither one of us got back on track. But what I was remembering was the Restless Woman, who made the documentary, and she said part of the problem when you go to see a doctor, a new doctor, is that you either just say I'm tired or something like that, and that's going to get you a misdiagnosis. Or you tell them everything you know about your symptoms, in which case they rapidly become convinced you're a complete hypochondriac because of the number of systems involved and the multiplicity
Yeah.
and the strange connections between these, branching and ever changing moving target stuff. And I've thought that going to a doctor, it's like if they don't know what MECFS is, those are your choices. Just tell them something simple or tell them the whole history. And that's a guarantee that you're in that job. And it's a really hard position to be in. So
Yeah, and that's
not bad.
a huge part of the reason why I wrote the book. I mean, for all the ways that my first doctor here traumatized me, she also was the fire under my ass to get the book written. And it took me over 20 years to
Yes.
research and write the book.
It is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece of feminist writing. It's a masterpiece just in its being. It is everything that Western patriarchal medicine, corporate, industrial medicine is not. Without even having to say it, it is like, this is the cure. This is what's wrong with the way we think, with the way our systems are set up. It just was such a it's just a marvel of synapsing, to tell you the truth. The connections you're making, and you're refusing to keep this all into this, keep the politics out of it. That's another book. That's a different thing. It's like, no, it isn't. That's right there in that meeting that traumatized me. It's right there. I just, we're kind of rounding out to the hour here. I could talk with you for hours. I just really want to help you get the word out about your book. I encourage everyone to read it. And I encourage all women all the time, believe yourself, believe your body.
Yes.
And if you can't find others who believe in you, keep going, keep going. The internet has been a huge godsend for lesbians, for incest survivors, for all of us who are so marginalized and easy to be made to gaslight ourselves and kill ourselves. It's not so easy anymore because we find each other and we believe each other. But this book is an absolute gift. And I just wanted to just say again, I wrote this, so I'm going to read it, but I sort of just said it, but I'm going to say it again. This book is a masterpiece of integration. And CFS is a disease of disconnection, as is the sorry history of misdiagnoses and malpractice, intentional or otherwise. What you have done is model the way back to sanity and health. This is a radiantly healthy book and a massive flex for a patient with this illness. I don't know how you did it. I mean, this would be a massive flex for a healthy person. It's a huge gift, and all practitioners need to read it as a lesson in humility, throwing the light on the biases hidden in plain sight, and literally killing women and minorities. So my whole little structure here went out the window. It's so dynamic talking with you. It's so life-giving. Do you have any closing thoughts before we stop the recording?
Well, in some ways you said it, like believe yourself. I think one last thing that that I'm encouraging to people to do if they have the energy, both mental and physical, is to, if you leave a doctor because that doctor treated you poorly, write a letter to that doctor and or their boss to let them know, because a lot of times we leave doctors and the doctors don't know why, and they think they're great, they think they're doing great treatment. And so when we speak up and let our doctors know, and we can do it in a way that they might be able to hear, if you want to just rant, you know, you can do that, but the doctor's more likely to hear you if you say it with some level of compassion or whatever. To try to sort of, that's like a micro way to try to change the culture, is one at a time. And my hope is to get into med schools and talk to people and try to get to doctors before they've gotten too set in their ways, but also to get to regular doctors too. And one of the things I've been doing is I have some books that my publisher sent me, and I've given copies to my doctors, and I've given them 3 copies with their permission. And I've asked them to give one to a medical colleague who could benefit from reading it, who's likely to be receptive but could benefit from reading it, and to give one to a patient who otherwise couldn't afford it. But also, it's in libraries, and if it's not in your library, you can request it. And I really just I wrote the book to change the culture.
American Breakdown. It's just wonderful. It's just wonderful.
And Carolyn,
appreciate
I
that
want to say
activism.
thank you for this. This has been a wonderful conversation. I love what you bring with your own brain and your own experience to this conversation. It's really important.
I think the doctors need to understand that low-income people with this disease take our lives. The difference between, if you look at who survives decades of this disease, they have a family they can go home to. That's huge. I didn't have that.
Yeah.
I went through it alone, and they have money. And it's really, when a doctor does that to you, you know, you just never know. It could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So many of these doctors, they never know how many people went home and killed themselves. It was their last attempt to get help. And they were just told yet again that it's their own fault. Yeah. And of course, if you say that to a doctor, they're going to write you up as suicidal, and God knows what happens then. But you can put it in a letter, and you can, you know, refer to the stats and other people. It's a disease with a very, very high rate of suicidality. And also because the psych drugs they misprescribed for it, often that's one of the side effects, is suicidal ideation. It's just a vicious circle. I love your activism around this. I'm going to quit the recording, and, you know, we'll stay online and debrief, but I encourage people to get the book. And you have a website, is this right, Lunden?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
www.jenniferlunden.com, and Lunden is Lunden.
Yep, there it is, Jennifer Lunden. You're probably seeing the letters backwards, so I forget. This is a Zoom. Anyway, all right. Well, thank you so much, Lunden. This has been just amazing. I'm going to stop the recording now. So goodbye, everybody.